US President Donald Trump is speaking with Russia's Vladimir Putin. The call between the two leaders comes as American-led efforts to secure an end to the war in Ukraine hits an impasse. On Friday, the first round of direct talks between Moscow and Kyiv were held in Istanbul, but it wasn't the face-to-face meeting between Putin and Zelensky that Washington was hoping for. Donald Trump, however, says that the war in Ukraine will only end after he meets with Vladimir Putin himself. Now, Trump is due to speak with Vladimir Zelensky after his call with Putin ends. For more on all of this, we can bring in our international affairs editor, Philip Turle. Philip, can we expect a breakthrough from these calls?
Well, if the talks that were held in Istanbul is anything to go by, the differences between the Ukrainians and the Russians are so great that it is virtually impossible to believe that there can be a last-minute breakthrough in this discussion between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Remember that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is not the same thing as Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky talking together to try to find a way out of the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump has set himself up as being the world's great peacemaker, wanting to bring Vladimir Putin on board without really criticizing the Russian leader at all since Trump returned to the White House in January. So I think he is hoping today there can be some kind of movement forward in all of this, but it's very difficult to see what they will agree upon because Russia's basic demands have remained unchanged since the start of the war back in February 2022. And even there have been efforts right the way down the line by Joe Biden, the former US president, by the European Union, by the Ukrainians, by the United Nations to try to bring Russia on board, all to no avail. So it's really a long shot to think that Donald Trump can make Vladimir Putin change his mind. I think what the United States is trying to put forward as an argument as well, the US is tired, the Russians are tired of this war. They want a way out. This is something that we're going to try to negotiate with Vladimir Putin because this has lasted far longer than he expected, because when he invaded Ukraine, he thought it was only going to be for 3 or 4 days and it would all be over. And here we are 3 years later and still the war is raging.
It is raging. And earlier we had the US Vice President who was asked about those US efforts to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. Take a listen to what JD Vance had to say.
Look, I think one open question is Vladimir Putin serious about negotiating peace, right? He has made some concessions. He has taken some serious steps in these conversations, but we feel like, we're at a point where we're hitting an impasse, and that's why the president is talking to him on the phone. That takes two to tango. I know the president's willing to do that, but if Russia's not willing to do that, then we're eventually just going to have to say, this is not our war. It's Joe Biden's war. It's Vladimir Putin's war. It's not our war. We're going to try to end it, but if we can't end it, we're eventually going to say, you know what, that was worth a try, but we're not doing it anymore.
Okay, that's not our war, worth a try, but we're not doing it anymore. What does that mean to you?
Well, we've had these kind of remarks from the US administration before saying, well, we're just going to walk away from this war. But it's very difficult for them to actually do that because they are involved militarily in supporting Ukraine, and there is a possibility they could pull out, but I think it would be far worse for them in the long run if they did do that. I think this is basically JD Vance trying to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to come up with some kind of an agreement. I think what we could see here, if nothing happens today in this phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, is that Donald Trump will then once again turn on Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and say, you have got to make effort on your side to placate Vladimir Putin by handing over the territory that he wants, including Crimea, refusing to join NATO. That's something that, in any case, that the United States has said that it is in favor of, not joining the European Union, not agreeing to have troops from the coalition of the willing peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine. All of those are conditions that are basic red lines for the Ukrainians. And that's something that Donald Trump could put the pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky over, like we already saw on the 28th of February in the Oval Office when they had this spat. So we don't really know how this is going to turn out today. But as I said, it's a long shot to think that in one simple phone call, Vladimir Putin's going to agree to end the war, agree to a ceasefire, agree to peace talks, when all the efforts up until now haven't led to that. And even it was Vladimir Putin himself who proposed the idea of these peace talks in Istanbul, and he didn't turn up to it. and neither did Volodymyr Zelensky. And so Donald Trump said, well, if I'd gone, the two leaders would have been there. Well, we can't be sure that is true. So we'll see what comes out of this phone call. But basically, I think Donald Trump is going to find it more difficult than maybe he thinks to try to bring this war to an end in a very quick and easy way.
We'll see if Donald Trump does even manage to secure a meeting with the Russian president, like he says is needed to bring this war to an end. Thank you very much for that, Philip Turle there.